Dus waar Willem fáilte chomh gachtaíonn an seo nniu aíonna cumráide sa cáide. Tá míad an seo nniu chun ceist Stáit Ochrais an téime agus ceist an Stáit Ochrais néidir go hé a phlé nniu. Agus nóí chun cuimhneáin a dhéanamh na léachra illig a bharigh an stracail sin na deithnear fórbás sin. I'd like to welcome everybody here today to this commemoration of the lives of the 10 hunger strikers from 1981, and also, of course, to debate and discuss some themes that are current and contemporary that also resonate from that period in time. It's not just an historical event, of course, and we must understand and remember the hunger strikes in their political context. It was part of a political struggle, and it wasn't just for the 5 demands that those 10 volunteers died, and certainly I won't be one to try and appropriate the bones of those dead volunteers, but I think it's very important as we go through today to bear in mind that it wasn't merely something that we can locate in 1981 and of course the preceding years of the blanket protest and the preceding hunger strike. In fact, if I may just briefly quote from Bobby Sands' diary from the first day of his hunger strike of that year, 1981, when he himself spoke about the fact that it wasn't just about the 10 demands, it was about a wider political context within which his initiative at the time, and he was subsequently joined, as we know, by many other men in the H blocks. He said that I am dying not just to attempt to end the barbarity of H block, or to gain the rightful recognition of a political prisoner, but primarily because what is lost here is lost for the Republic and those wretched oppressed, whom I am deadly proud to know as the risen people. I think it's very important that we, again, when we commemorate and remember those volunteers who died on hunger strike, that we understand that that was part of the dynamics of conflict at the time. And again, in the second session here this afternoon, Brown, McCunny and Mandy Duffy are going to talk about the reality that as long as imperialism, occupation, colonialism are a fact of life in any country, there will be resistance. And of course today in McGavery prison you can see how that manifests itself. Yeah? And you've seen some of the imagery coming out of men with the same types of appearance as the men on the blanket in the late 70s and early 80s, etc. We may not agree with the political analysis of some of those people, we may not agree with their methods, but we certainly understand that that context is very similar. And of course Brown and Mandy will talk about that. Just before I introduce the speaker for this session today, I'd also like to draw your attention to the fact that as of from Tuesday last, the Palestinian prisoners, in particular the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, their prisoners have engaged in the tactic that we're all familiar with of hunger strike, and this is a very serious thing. So what I'd like to do first of all is announce that in light of this development, Éirígí has called a protest for next Wednesday at 6:30 outside the Israeli embassy on Pembroke Road. It has been advertised. I encourage everybody here to get to it. It's very important, and obviously to pass that along through their own networks. Before I do introduce the speaker for the first session, I do want to, I'm very glad to be able to read out a statement on behalf of the prisoners of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which I'll do just now. We, the comrades of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine in Zionist prisons and detention centres, declare to the steadfast, struggling, brave masses of the Palestinian people and to all free people in the world. We announce that we will begin an open-ended hunger strike on Tuesday morning, September the 27th, 2011, in response to the official policies of the Zionist government and its fascist prison administration. We demand our rights and our dignity as we struggle for the victory of our values and ideals. Our goals for this hunger strike are as follows. 1. End the solitary confinement and isolation of our comrade, General Secretary of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Comrade Ahmad Saad, member of the Legislative Council and PLO Central Executive Council, Abu Ghassan. Secondly, end the policy of isolation for all prisoners. Thirdly, end the policy of systematic humiliation by the occupation army against the Palestinian people at checkpoints and crossings, particularly targeting visitors to prisons, and end the arbitrary denial of visits to the prisoners, especially the prisoners of the Gaza Strip. End the humiliation and abuse of prisoners during transfer. The principles of our revolution include the rejection of all forms of injustice, and for us to struggle and confront the occupier in all areas and places in our own manner. Accordingly, we call upon all of the Palestinian and Arab people, political forces and institutions, human rights and civil society organisations to raise their voices for us, so that we do not become easy prey for a vicious occupier. We promise to all our people and to the legacy of the martyrs of Palestine that we will continue on our path until victory. Great glory to the martyrs, victory to the revolution, victory is inevitable. And now I'd like to introduce our first guest today. Many people here, she'll be already quite well known. Máire Drumm spent 4 years in prison in Armagh from 1975 to 79, and she's here to tell us about that experience, in particular the experience of being a woman in prison at that time, blanket protests, etc., where the focus has usually been on the men in Longkesh and the H blocks. And you know, Máire isn't all that familiar with public speaking. She won't mind me saying she's a little bit anxious at this, but of course we'll give her a big fall to road, and I'm sure everything will be fine for her.
When I was in prison, I had political status, but I want to talk today a wee bit about the position of the women who were protesting prisoners. It was the equivalent of the fellas in H block. But I'd like you to remember too, at that time, there were women in this state, Republican women in jail in this state. There was women in jail in England and women in jail overseas as well. And I remember the part played by the women outside. That was wives, mothers, sisters, daughters, without whose support the prisoners never could have survived. And I can speak a wee bit from that angle, because before I went into prison, my mother and father had both been in at the one time. After I got out and got married, my husband was then a blanket man, so I can see it from both sides. We got one political status after the hunger strikes in 1972 in Crumlin Road Jail. They were led by Billy McKay and Frances McGarden. Women POWs from then on weren't forced to do prison work. They had free association, which meant we could mix with each other at all times. We had the right to education, and we'd never had to wear a prison uniform again. No one had to wear a prison uniform, any prisoners. We belonged to the A Company, which was in Armagh Jail, and the command structures that we would have had on the outside were recognised by the governors and screws in the prison. So all dealings that we ever had with the regime in the prison was done through ROC Eileen Hickey. We never went near them ourselves. The prison uniforms became a thing of the past, not only for POWs, but for what was known as ODCs, Ordinary Decent Criminals. That was their title. Of course, we weren't criminals at all, so that was besides it. The conditions that we lived in remained in place until the removal of political status in 1976, and this was part of the Ulsterisation, criminalisation and normalisation policy, the strategy that the British had in place at that time. The same for the female prisoners as for the male prisoners in the H blocks. Anyone who was imprisoned because of an action carried out after the 1st of March 1976 was no longer entitled to be called a political prisoner. Now, the strange part of that was, if you come into jail after that date, but were charged with something before, say you were charged with something in February 1976, you got political status. But if the thing happened after the 1st of March, you weren't a political prisoner. During that time, in August of that year, 76, my mother, who was Vice President of Sinn Féin, a political party, she was in A Wing without political status, and I was in B Wing with political status. So it shows you the whole irony of the thing. The difference, there was a big difference between Armagh and the fellas in the H block, in that Armagh there was only 2 wings in the jail, A Wing and B Wing. They were joined together by a small passageway which contained the chapel. So the 2 yards were beside one another, so we all had more contact with, we had contact with each other, whereas the fellas in the H blocks wouldn't have had any contact with the political status prisoners there. We saw each other at Mass and at confession, and a funny thing about the confession I was saying to someone was that our chaplain was Father Murray. I'm sure some of you have heard of Father Raymond Murray, who was brilliant to all the Republican prisoners in the jail. But on a Saturday night he held confessions, and he took us first, and we used to have these parcel coats, massive big coats, where we carried parcels over for the protesting prisoners. The screws knew, some of them tried to stop it, but others just let it go. We went into the confession box, left the parcel down with the name of the person it was for. They went to confession after us, and they were able to pick their parcels up. So we made a bit of a farce of the whole thing. Like, the remand prisoners at that time didn't work. So the protest really only came into being when the first of the women without status were sentenced, and those changes became more noticeable. Every morning the screws came and told the women they had to go to work. Every morning the women told them they weren't going to work. They were political prisoners and they weren't going to work. So when they refused to go to work, they were locked up for the rest of the day. Every day they refused to go, they lost a day's remission, and this was their life from then on. The other farce of the thing was that Máire Farrell was OC of the protesting prisoners then, and she was recognised by the governors in the Screw as the OC, and all dealings on the protesting wing were done through her. So even though they said these women weren't political prisoners, they were being recognised, the command structures were being recognised as such. Because the women had their own clothes, unlike the men in the blocks where they went on the blanket, there was no restriction put on any clothing they were given at that time, and they were allowed black clothes in. And they continued a tradition that had been held in Armagh from political status was granted, and that when a volunteer died on the outside, we held a commemoration in the prison where we had the flags, the colour party and that, and a narration for them. After a parade that was given for volunteer Dee Delaney, who was killed in January 1980, things were changed drastically within Armagh. It was on the 7th of February 1980 that things came to a head, and the women were called for their dinner. Some of them laughed afterwards and said they should have known when they were called that day there was something wrong, but they were that hungry because they didn't get food in the parcels the same way they did before. The food left a lot to be desired, but on that particular day they were told there was chicken and chips for the dinner, and because chicken and chips was one of the most decent things they ever got to eat, they all made a beehive for the serving thing. They got to the serving, and one of the friends of mine who'd been in both times says the worst about it was, she says, we never even got the chicken and chips. As soon as they got to the serving hatch, the gates burst open, and about 60 male screws in riot gear came flying through the gates and grabbed the women. Some of them tried to get back up to the cells for things they would have had in their cells. They were trailed back down by the hair and beaten into two what were called association rooms. They were for the TV. And that's what she says to me, if we hadn't even had the chicken in with us, we'd have had something to eat, but they didn't. The only way the women could retaliate was by firing the trays that they had for their food. But they got them in, they dragged them in by the hair, and they beat them into these two rooms and left them there till about 10 o'clock at night. No food, no toilet. They didn't know why, they didn't know what was going on or what was happening. The screws, the governor refused to speak to Máire Farrell. And it was that night about 10 o'clock they started taking them back to their cells, one or two at a time, and that was it. And when they got back to the cells, they found out there had been massive cell searches, and among the things that were taken were all their black clothes. Anything they had black was taken. And I think it was because the screws knew this was the only way they could stop them still acting as volunteers in the IRA within prison, was by taking these black skirts and black jumpers. They hadn't got to the toilet, they had no food, and the next morning they should normally get up at be wakened at 7:30 to go out to the toilet and to get their dinner, or their breakfast, sorry. But there were, about 10 o'clock the screws started to come. The first door they opened was Máire Farrell's, the OC, and she went out with the chamber pot, which was all you had, which, as I said, had been used from early just that evening before. They were told they could go for their breakfast, but they weren't allowed into the toilets or into the washroom. They were locked up and barred to them. So Maria did the only thing she could do with the chamber pot that was full and threw it over the class. Some of it, of course, went over the screws, and they locked her back up. They opened another couple of girls up, and when the same thing happened, shoved them back into the cell. They didn't allow any of them to have breakfast. The rest of the day they got no food, they weren't allowed out for the toilet, they were just kept on lock-up, and the male screws were lying on both sides of the wing. It just seemed to be a strategy by the NIO and the prisons that there was just going to be a clamp down on these women. Like, who did they think they were? We're the bosses here and we'll show them. But at the end of the day, the women showed them they weren't going to be browbeaten by them. After it happened a couple of days and they still didn't get to the toilet, they were emptying the chamber pots onto the door, wherever they could go, because that was all they could go, and that was the start of what was the no wash protest for the women prisoners. As I say, because they didn't wear uniforms, they didn't have to go on a blanket. Brad Farrell had given the prison administration every opportunity to prevent this happening. She told them, she warned them what would happen, but no, the governor wasn't having any of it. This was what was happening, and that was it. Conditions got gradually worse for the women. They were now in 23-hour lockup. They had no association with each other outside their own cell. Some of them were doubled up in a cell, which meant they had company. Other girls were on their own. They had one visit a month where they were allowed a change of clothes, and it was one change of clothes for that month. So from each month, the parcels, they were living in this dirt in that same change of clothes until the next month when their families come up again to them. By April, conditions were dreadful for them, and they had no choice. They had to start, like the blanket men, smearing the walls with their excrement and that, because they had nowhere else to put it. When they threw it through the wee spy holes in the door, the screws, the male screws came and nailed up the spy holes. When they threw it out the windows, the male screws came again and boarded the windows. So for 23 hours a day they were living in darkness. No light, nothing coming in. They were allowed out for meals, and they had a half-an-hour exercise every day, because under their basic human rights they had to give them this. And just remember, these were all young women. They were in their teens and early 20s. No allowances were made for any of these women who had periods. They still weren't allowed to wash, and they still had to use that same chamber pot. No way of rinsing it out, nothing else. It was degrading and inhumane treatment for women. Every few days after that, they would take them out of the cell they were in, one cell at a time, and put them into what they called a clean cell. A clean cell was one that had been hosed down by male screws who wore protective clothing and masks. The minute it was hosed down, they moved the women in. And for a day or two after that, they had breathing problems, they had problems with their eyes because of this strong bleach. It wasn't good enough for these male screws to be open to the bleach or anything, but it was good enough for the women. Some of the older screws now who had been there when I was there with political status, some of them were decent enough, and they refused to go on the protesting wing. They refused to work on with the girls. They said they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't go in and hose them down, and they wouldn't treat them like that. The screws were baffled. The governor couldn't understand how young women could live like this. These women, when they were going out on their visits, had been always very particular about hygiene. They were always very particular about their appearance. And now they were living in their own filth and their own dirt, in these dirty clothes for a month at a time. They thought the women would have been easier to break. But what they didn't allow for was the strength of resolve these women had, and the Republican spirit, that just because they were in prison, it still hadn't left them. The women were prisoners, were Republican prisoners, they weren't criminals, and they were refused point blank to be treated as such. The first hunger strike came that the men were on, and on the 1st of December there were 3 girls, Máire Farrell, Mary Doyle and Máire Nugent, joined their male comrades on the protest. They continued on it until the 19th of December. As you all know, that hunger strike was called off when it seemed an agreement had been reached, but as usual the Brits reneged on the agreement after the hunger strike had been called off. During this whole period of the hunger strike and the no wash protest and all, they kept each other's morals going. They weren't allowed books, and they weren't allowed, with political status you were allowed whatever books you wanted, you were allowed records, you were allowed radios. They were allowed none of this, so they kept it going. The organised concert for night time, singing, storytelling. They all says now, if they were at a party, they wouldn't allow each other to sing at all because what they suffered in those couple of years. Sometimes it was worse listening to each other than listening to the screws. They continued to learn Irish, teach each other Irish, and they used the heating. There were old cells. Armagh was a really old prison. There was big heating cells, the heating pipes, and they had bored those round the side. You used to pass things through to each other and tap on and talk to each other. They had a wee radio, a wee crystal radio that used to sit on the pipes to heat up, and they would have heard the news, and during the next hunger strike they knew what was happening outside and what was happening to their comrades in the blocks. In January 1981, in a tactical move after the calling off of the first hunger strike, the No Wash protest in Armagh was called off. They were asked to do so by their comrades in the H blocks. As I said, it was a tactical move because they knew by that stage another hunger strike was inevitable, and they wanted the attention and the focus to be on the hunger strike and not have anything else distracting from it. So the women continued on the no work protest, continued just to refuse to go to work every morning, and they used their time then to write to influential people and hope that maybe their voices and their support would compel Maggie Thatcher to agree to the demands, the 5 demands that the prisoner had. 5 basic demands, but to no avail. After the deaths of their comrades in the H blocks and the end of the hunger strike, it was agreed that a new strategy was needed for the protest within the prison, and the women decided to beat the screws, the prison administration, at their own game, and declared themselves available for work. The screws and the governor were sort of taken aback and weren't sure how to deal with it. They knew the women weren't defeated, but they couldn't refuse to let them go to work. So the women, for the first time in 13 months, they got a bath, they got their hair washed, and they got back to their cells. They got up the next morning to go to work, and the 2 jobs that were available in Armagh, the differences, as I say, there was differences there, but there was 2 jobs available. One was a sewing room, and in that sewing room they had to make jeans for the ODCs, as again they were called in the Crum. They still wore uniforms. But the screw that was in charge of that, she was one of the screws who had refused to go on the protest wing, very civil to the girls. But the girls just went to work with these jeans to sabotage the whole thing. They said the machines wouldn't work, they sewed the seams wrong and then spent the day ripping them out. They cut, when they were cutting the seam, they cut holes in the jeans. And they were supposed to have a quota every day for these jeans. And this wee screw was afraid. She had to have the quota done for the governor. She was afraid they would get it put on a report, which meant they would have been put on the boards or punished in some way. So she used to spend her lunch hour and work overtime to finish this quota by the way the girls had done it. So the girls sat there and yarned each other the whole time. The only other job there was at that time was cleaning. They all volunteered. Nobody had a problem cleaning. It was their own wing they were cleaning. They were cleaning outside their own cells, their own toilets. We had always done that as POWs, looked after our own place, so they continued in that. That's the way they went from then on. But in 1982, another change came and they started strip searching the women in Armagh. For the female prisoners, the ones most affected were remand prisoners who had to go to court. Other prisoners were ones on parole and ones going to family prisons. Every time they left the prison, they were strip searched. Every time they came back, they were strip searched again. And I mean strip searched. They pulled the clothes off them because the girls wouldn't do it themselves. It got so bad, and the screws had never left them all day. They were with them the whole time. But it got so bad that in the end, they were asked to call off the resistance to the strip searches because some of the girls were hurt so badly they were really afraid of some terrible injury being caused, and they were called off. Eventually, they ended up with segregation, not through want of giving it to them, but it was just they were able to work the system then and they got it. After this, the British establishment and all thought that women would be the weak link in the chain in the fight for political status and in the fight in the prisons. But they didn't reckon on the spirit of the women that were in those jails. If they had thought about why they were in the jail in the first place, they would have known. What they were capable of outside, they weren't going to put up with inside. And if history should teach them one thing, teach the British one thing, it'll teach them to never try to criminalise Republican prisoners, especially women, because they will not give in. It won't work. It didn't work then, and it won't work now. And it won't work when they see the case of Marion Price sitting in a cell in Maghaberry in a wing on her own. And if any other women prisoners are going in, the same as the prisoners fighting now, it'll happen again. So I think if they try and remember that, but then the British never learn, so they probably won't learn from this either. Just on a wee note, when we were in prison, I often say, sometimes my own experience, you could say it was some of the worst times of my life and some of the best times. While I was in prison, my mummy was murdered in the hospital. I got out just for her funeral. On the other hand, the comradeship, the solidarity you had with the other women, they've remained friends for life. Like it's so we talk about the girls in Armagh. We're all grannies, a couple of them are great grannies, but we still look on ourselves as those girls, probably wishful thinking. We've all remained friends, gone different ways maybe in political ideas, but we've all still remained friends. So as I say, they were the best years. Great people to be in with, and learnt great things about life. You learnt from the different walks of life that people came to. We all hope it would never come to that again, but if it did, I know that the women would still stay strong, because they will never be browbeaten by the British into being treated like that in prison. That's all I.